After so many oracles about judgment and destruction and references to the sins which have brought them about, chapter 11 gives us a brief pause as the Lord reveals the depths of his feelings about this terrible situation. We remember from Exodus 34 that the Lord proclaimed his name to Moses on Mount Sinai, declaring that he was merciful and gracious and slow to anger. When we read these judgment oracles, we must keep in mind that God has seen many evil things occurring in Israel over a long time. He is not reacting quickly or without warning. Chapter 11 shows now the anguish behind the judgment, the sort of character and relationship with his people that prove his words to Moses to be true. God recalls the Exodus story where, as we have seen, titles like warrior, deliverer, and rock were frequently applied to God. But here God is father to his son Israel. The warrior who crushed Egypt instructs Moses to say to Pharaoh in Exodus 4:22-23 that Israel is his firstborn son, and to let his son go that he might worship him. It is because Israel is God's son that Pharaoh will ultimately lose his own son, as God makes plain in verse 23. So this is not sentimental imagery now being taken up by the prophet after so many threats. The reality of this relationship, which has not dimmed on God's side for all these generations, is of parent and child. Because of this relationship and its importance to God, the hammer blows which must fall on Israel will not, according to verse 9, completely destroy him. Returning to verse 1, we have the familiar words which Matthew quotes in chapter 2 of his Gospel. The context there is the refuge of the Holy Family in Egypt, where, once Herod the Great has died, God summons them back to Israel. We can see that, as it stands in Hosea, it is no prophecy of what will happen to Jesus when he is an infant. Instead, God remembers rescuing Israel, his son, from slavery in Egypt. How then does this verse relate to Jesus? Why, for Matthew, is this a fulfillment of Scripture? Part of the answer is that for the Jews, history is cyclical. The events and meanings of the Exodus will be repeated. As one scholar put it, the end will be like the beginning. Thus, the first Christians could look on the most significant moments of Israel's history and find in it parallels or foreshadowings of what Jesus went through. And there is no more significant aspect of Israel's history than that they were regarded by God as his son. The fact that the infant Jesus had to be protected from a king trying to kill him already places him in the narrative world of Exodus 1-2. Matthew understood that Jesus' story retells that of Israel's, and so Hosea 11:1 simply serves as confirmation. Verses 3, God pictures those early days as a tottering baby. When he falls, God picks him up in his arms. But they did not know who it was who healed them. The word heal recalls Exodus 15, where God tells Israel that I am the Lord who heals you. In verse 4, leading Israel now recalls their wilderness wanderings with God at their head. When he bent down to feed Israel, this recalls the provision of manna. But in verse 5, for all this, Israel wants to return to Egypt, and so Assyria will be their king. What this likely means is that Israel at this time is under the domination of Assyria and has, against prophetic advice, gone down to Egypt to ask for help. This will be seen for what it is, an attempt at rebellion, and Assyria will respond accordingly. This appeal to Egypt is presumably the meaning of carrying oil to Egypt in chapter 12, verse 1. Judah has been mentioned favourably in the last verse of chapter 11 as one who still walks with the Lord, but now in chapter 12 he is added to the indictment. In terms of history, God looks back from Exodus to Genesis and to Jacob in particular. Why focus on Jacob, and is this for a positive or negative purpose? In the prophets, Jacob usually refers to national Israel, as it seems to in verse 2. But then Hosea goes on to speak of the patriarch. Is the ancestor being contrasted with the nation, so as to say that the nation has gone astray from the faith of its ancestor? Or are Jacob's dubious moments being highlighted to say that the nation is, unfortunately, just like its ancestor? It is probably best to take verses 3 to 6 as positive. That is, Jacob is the original example to whom Israel are to look. In both episodes, as a baby in utero and as a man fighting with the angel, Jacob is struggling. On the basis of the latter incident, he is given the name Israel and is granted a special revelation at Bethel. The military name of God, the God of hosts, is mentioned in verse 5, reminding Israel that this same God who spoke to Jacob at Bethel, who they are named after as a nation, is the one who will defend them against their mighty enemies, if, as verse 6 exhorts, they will return to God. Jacob is mentioned again in verse 12 regarding the time he guarded sheep for Laban in order to marry Rachel. The word guard is the link with the next verse regarding Moses, who is the prophet by whom God brought up Israel from Egypt, and whose words still stand as their guard. The reflections on their history will continue in the next chapter. These reminders serve to show the justice of God's verdict and his long-suffering patience, but they are also the basis of an appeal that things can go back to the way they once were.